The Oregon Cascades, October 1926, 20 minutes before 6 in the morning. Frank Aldrich, 41, 12 years running geared locomotives on logging lines, standing beside a 70-ton, 3-truck Shay at the head of a temporary spur, looking down a grade of nearly 7% that he is about to descend with 12 loaded log cars behind him. It has rained all night, the rail is wet, the ties beneath it were laid 4 months ago on ground that was forest floor in the spring, and the total weight coupled behind his locomotive this morning is somewhere over 400 tons of green Douglas fir. Before he climbed into the cab, Aldrich walked the first quarter-mile of the grade on foot. He was not admiring the view. He was reading the same things he read every morning of the hauling season: how much water was standing between the ties, whether the fine wet needles of autumn had built a film on the railhead, whether the outside rail on the second curve, the one the track gang had respiked twice that summer, had spread under yesterday's loads. On a common carrier railroad in the valley below, none of these questions would exist because the track would be ballasted, surveyed, and permanent. Up here, the track existed for one purpose and one season: to get this timber out. It was engineered to be just good enough, and Frank Aldrich's job was to know, every single morning, exactly where just good enough stood that day. Here is the fact that shaped everything else about that morning. A conventional steam locomotive, the kind pulling passenger trains through Portland, could not have survived a week on this track. Its long, rigid wheelbase would have derailed on the curves, and its driving wheels would have lost traction on the grade. The machine Aldrich ran instead was a different answer to a different problem: an engine designed from the frame up for track that was steep, crooked, temporary, and cheap, because the track had to follow the timber, and the timber did not grow along convenient contours. 12 loaded cars, 7%, wet steel. A machine built specifically for this, and still operating at the edge of what it could hold. What exactly had the Shay's designers changed about the very idea of a locomotive to make a railroad in this terrain possible at all? And why did that design put the machine's entire braking argument, on a morning like this one, into the judgment of the man in the cab? What the Shay's designers had changed was almost everything except the boiler. A conventional locomotive drove 2 or 3 large wheels on each side through rigid rods, and it depended on weight over those wheels for grip. The Shay, patented by Ephraim Shay and built by the Lima, works in Ohio, mounted 3 vertical cylinders on the right side of the boiler, and those cylinders drove a jointed, flexible line shaft running the length of the machine, turning every axle on every truck through bevel gears. Every wheel under the locomotive was a driving wheel. The boiler sat offset to the left simply to balance the machinery's weight. The truck swiveled, so the machine could follow curves that would have derailed a rod engine. The gearing traded speed for pull, so the whole locomotive rarely exceeded 18 miles an hour, and could climb grades in excess of 10%, on light, cheap, badly maintained rail, which was precisely the point. Lima built roughly 2,770 of them between 1880 and 1945. The Climax works in Pennsylvania built about 1,100 of their own variant, with angled cylinders driving a central shaft, a design many crews swore rode rougher and pulled steadier. The Heisler, and later, Portland's own Willamette Iron and Steel Works added hundreds more. More of Lima's Shays went to Washington state than almost anywhere else on Earth, because nowhere else was the specific problem they solved so large: mountains full of the biggest commercial timber in the world, and no way to walk it out. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of American logging between 1900 and 1980. What the falling crew, the steam donkey, the logging railroad, or the river drive actually required, what the men running them had to know, and what the wood they cut actually became once it reached the mill. Not folklore about giant lumberjacks. The documented technical reality of a dangerous trade, practiced by skilled men under real physical risk. What a geared locomotive crew's judgment gave a logging operation was not power, the machine supplied that, but the read of grade, load, and wet steel that decided whether the power stayed under control. And if someone in your family worked in the woods in this era, put it in the comments. Did anyone in your family work a logging railroad, engineer, brakeman, section hand? What line, what camp, what years? Next on this channel, the steam donkey, the cable engine that had to drag an 80-ton log to the landing before any train could take it anywhere. back to the woods. The machine, then, was the answer to the terrain. But a machine that could climb a 10% grade also had to come back down it, loaded. What did that descent actually demand of Frank Aldrich and the brakemen riding the cars behind him? The descent demanded a calculation that started before the train moved. Aldrich's first decision was the oldest one on any mountain railroad. How much train? 12 loads on dry rail was one train. 12 loads on wet October rail, over needles crushed into a slick film on the railhead, was a different train entirely. And an engineer who treated them as the same train was the kind of engineer logging companies did not employ for long. Regional logging company records and published oral histories from Northwest lines describe the runaway, a loaded train whose speed passed the point where brakes could recover it, as the characteristic catastrophe of the logging railroad, the railside equivalent of the faller's barber chair, rare, sudden, and usually unsurvivable for the crew riding it. Against that possibility, Aldrich had three tools, and every one of them ran through human judgment. The locomotive's own brakes and its gearing, which let the engine itself hold back part of the load the way a truck holds a hill in low gear. Sand, dropped ahead of the wheels to cut through the wet film, a finite supply he had to ration across the whole grade. And the brakemen. On the steepest logging lines of this era, brakemen moved along the tops of the loaded cars while the train crawled downgrade, setting hand brakes car by car, walking on wet bark, over couplings, on a moving train, on a 7% grade, in rain. The brakeman's judgment was as specific as the engineer's: which cars to tie down, how hard, in what order, because too little braking let the train build speed, and too much locked wheels into a slide that gave no braking at all, and ground flat spots into every locked wheel. None of this was written as numbers in a rulebook, because no rulebook could carry it. The grade changed with every relocated spur. The rail changed with every rain. What held 400 tons of timber to a crawl was a running conversation. Whistle signals, hand signals, the feel of slack running in and out of the couplings, between men who had each learned, on this specific class of track, what the morning's specific conditions would allow. And every foot of the track they were reading had been laid by hand, months earlier, by men who knew they would pull it all up again, who built a railroad that was designed, from the first spike, to be temporary. And how did an entire steel transportation system learn to move through a forest like a tide? The men who built Aldrich's track were called the Steel Gang, and their product was deliberately impermanent. A logging railroad had two kinds of line. The main line, the trunk from the woods down to the mill, or the common carrier connection, was built to last years, graded, sometimes ballasted, its trestles inspected. But branching off it, reaching into each new cutting area, ran the spurs, and the spurs obeyed a completely different logic. Track gangs followed the cutting crews, extending steel into freshly cut ground, and when a unit was logged out, the same crews came back, pulled the spikes, lifted the rail, loaded it onto flat cars, and laid it down again miles away in the next setting. Some spurs carried trains for only a few months before they moved. It was infrastructure behaving like a tool. The rail itself was light, often second-hand steel bought worn from the mainline railroads, because it did not need to survive decades, only one cut. Ties were hewn on the spot from the timber standing beside the grade, unpreserved, laid on bare earth, because they too would be abandoned or moved. Curvature and grade that no common carrier would tolerate were accepted deliberately, because the geared locomotives could handle them, and every degree of curve accepted was a mile of expensive grading avoided. Where slopes beat even the shays, companies built inclines, track lowered straight down a mountainside, cars let down on cables, and where ravines interrupted, trestles went up in days, framed from unpeeled logs cut within sight of their own footings. Published engineering accounts and company records from Northwest operations describe the arithmetic that governed all of it. The cost of every foot of spur had to be paid back by the timber that foot of spur reached. The Steel Gang's foreman was, in effect, continuously redesigning a transportation network around a resource that was consumed by the act of reaching it. When people describe the logging railroad as thousands of miles of track, the number is real, but it was never all on the ground at once. It flowed. The railroad moved through the forest the way the cut itself moved, a tide of steel following the timber and withdrawing behind it. All of that steel, all of those trains, existed to feed timber to a country that was consuming wood at a rate hard to picture now, And here the story folds back on itself, in a way few people expect. Who was the biggest single customer for the wood these trains hauled out of the mountains? The biggest single customer for American timber, through the years this network was built, was the railroad industry itself, not the logging lines, the whole continental system, the iron road that was never mostly iron. Rails and engines aside, nearly everything else a railroad was made of was wood. The cars, the stations, the bridges and trestles, the telegraph poles, the fences, and above all, the crosties. A single mile of track sat on more than 2,500 of them, and an untreated tie in the ground lasted, on average, 5 to 7 years before rot and fungus finished it. Multiply that across a national network that had exploded past 200,000 miles, and the arithmetic becomes a standing industrial appetite, millions upon millions of ties, cut, hewn, delivered, and spiked down every single year, forever, just to keep the existing system standing still. By the late 19th century, railroads were absorbing between 20 and 25% of all the timber the United States produced, for ties, bridges, stations, fences, and fuel, and that appetite carried well into the era of Frank Aldrich's morning descent. The creosote pressure-treating plants that spread in the early 20th century stretched a tie's life and eased the drain, but they changed the scale of the demand, not its nature. Sit with what that means for the train easing down that Oregon grade. Some fraction of the timber chained to those 12 cars would become houses in Portland and Los Angeles. Some would become the framing of factories and the forms that shaped a young century's concrete. And some of it would come back as track, sawn into ties, soaked black with creosote, and spiked under the rails of the very network that made a national lumber market possible in the first place. The railroad hauled the forest out of the mountains, and the forest, in turn, held the railroad up off the ground. Each was consuming the other, and both were expanding. There is no cleaner picture anywhere in American industrial history of infrastructure and resource locked in a single circulating system. Regional archives from Oregon, Washington, and Idaho document where that system reached its densest form. Washington rose from 31st among states in timber production in 1880 to first in the nation by 1905, and held first place almost without interruption for 3 decades. What did the network that made that possible actually look like on the ground, across those 3 states, at its peak? On the ground, at its peak in the 1920s, the network looked like this. Washington, first in the nation in lumber production from 1905, a rank it held almost every year for 3 decades, carried logging railroads on the Olympic Peninsula, through the Cascades, along Gray's Harbor and Puget Sound, operated by companies whose names were the economy of entire counties. Oregon's common carrier system crested at about 3,300 miles in the same decade, and threaded between and beyond those public lines ran the private logging trackage that never appeared on a passenger timetable at all. The Coast Range lines feeding the Columbia River mills, the pine railroads out of Bend, where 2 Great Lakes firms had opened modern sawmills on opposite banks of the Deschutes in 1916, and pushed their rails deeper into the Ponderosa every season. In Idaho, the white pine country of the Panhandle ran its logs to mills at towns like St. Marie's and Potlatch, a town built by, named for, and entirely owned by the timber company it served. That was the other thing the railroad built: company towns, Valsetts in the Oregon Coast Range, Hines in the Eastern Pine. Whole communities that existed because a logging railroad reached a particular valley, school, store, church, and mill, all of it standing at the end of the company's own track, all of it dependent on the timber the track could still reach. A regional geography, in other words, drawn not by rivers or highways, but by where a Shay could climb. But most of the men who worked these lines did not live in towns at all. They lived at the end of the steel, in the camps, and the camps, like the track, were built to move. What did daily life actually look like out along the spurs, where the railroad was not just how you worked, but where you lived, what woke you, and the only way in or out? The camp Frank Aldrich hauled out of was itself rolling stock. By the 1920s, many Northwest rail camps were built as car camps, bunkhouses, cookhouse, filing shack, and office framed on skids or directly on flat car frames, so that when the cut moved, the town moved with it, coupled into a train and hauled to the next setting. Period photographs from the Kinsey documentary record show exactly that. whole communities of buildings riding the rail. A camp of 100 or 200 men could pick itself up and be serving breakfast 15 miles away within days. The railroad set the clock of that life. The morning crew train, flat cars fitted with benches, or plain empties, carried fallers, buckers, and rigging men out to the settings. The locomotive's whistle marked the start of work, the end of it, and, by long-standing signal codes, the things nobody wanted to hear. Published oral histories from these camps describe the whistle's vocabulary bluntly. Certain signals meant logs coming, certain signals meant stop everything, and a specific sustained signal meant a man was hurt and the train was now an ambulance, because the train was the only ambulance, just as it was the mail, the payroll, the grocery delivery, and the one road home. A man who quit a rail camp, and turnover in this industry was constant, left the way everything else did, on the log train, riding down the mountain with the timber. The cookhouse anchored the whole arrangement. Logging camps competed for crews partly on food, because the work burned men down, and a camp that fed badly bled its best hands to the camp over the ridge. The cook's authority at his own tables was, by every period account, absolute. This was the world the logging railroad made, mobile, male, isolated, self-contained, and wholly dependent on a single steel thread. Which is why what happened next happened so fast. Out on the newest roads below the camps, a machine was appearing that needed no track gang, no trestles, no steel thread at all. What did the truck actually offer that the railroad, after 50 years of refinement, could not answer? What the truck offered was the deletion of the railroad's entire fixed cost. A logging railroad had to buy locomotives, rail, and rolling stock, survey, grade, and bridge every foot it ran, and pay a steel gang to build, maintain, and move it all, before the first log earned $1. A truck needed a road, and a road could be bulldozed. By the 1930s, the crawler tractor that was already changing yarding could carve a truck road up a slope in days, along alignments no track could follow, at a fraction of the cost per mile. The truck did not have to pay back its route with the timber the route reached, because the route was nearly free. The shift ran in stages, and for a while the two systems worked as partners, trucks hauling from the stump down short dirt roads to a rail reload, the train still handling the long miles to the mill. But every improvement in trucks, tires, brakes, and public highways moved the reload point further down the mountain, and every mile it moved was a mile of spur nobody would ever build again. The Depression thinned the rail operations. The war worked the survivors to exhaustion hauling emergency timber, and when companies re-equipped after 1945, the arithmetic had quietly settled. On the Olympic Peninsula, Rayonier, one of the great rail operators, had stopped building spurs to new logging sites entirely by 1960, trucking every log down to what remained of its main line, behind diesels that had replaced the steam fleet. Across the Northwest, the pattern repeated. The spurs died first, then the branches, then the main lines themselves, sold, scrapped, or buried under the very truck roads that had replaced them. For the men, the trade did not disappear. It changed shape. The judgment Frank Aldrich exercised at the top of a grade migrated into the cab of a loaded log truck easing onto a 10% dirt descent, where brakes, gears, and load behaved by rules just as unforgiving. The danger had not been abolished, it had been rehoused. By the early 1960s, nearly all the classic logging railroads were gone. Nearly. Which lines held out, and what was the last log train in America actually like? A few lines held out where the geography still favored steel. In the Idaho Panhandle, log trains ran out of the White Pine Country toward St. Marie's for decades more. And on the south edge of the Olympics, the Simpson operation at Shelton, Washington, a railroad with roots in the 1880s, kept hauling logs behind diesels over a 10-mile remnant of its once sprawling system into the 21st century, the last of its kind in the United States when it finally shut down. But those were survivals, not the system. The system, the moving tide of spurs, the geared steam, the car camps, the whistle codes, was finished as a way of logging by the early 1960s. The forest closed back over most of the grades, and in places the only remaining evidence is a line of rotting trestle bents standing in second growth, holding up nothing. If this channel is going to keep documenting what it actually took to log an American forest by hand and by steam, there are more falling crews, more steam donkeys, more logging railroads, and more river drives that quietly built the houses, the towns, and the railroads of a growing country, and were never described as historically significant at the time, because the men doing the work didn't have time to think of it that way. What the crews of the logging railroads gave the trade was never the power. The machines carried that, but the judgment that kept the power on the rail, morning after wet morning. And if you have a connection, a relative who worked as a faller, a donkey engineer, a riverman, a brakeman, a log truck driver, put it in the comments. What line did they work, what camp, what years, and what did they say about the grades? Next on this channel, the steam donkey, the cable engine that had to move the log before any train could haul it. Frank Aldrich's work as a logging railroad engineer ended, in its original form, in 1949, when his company pulled its last spur and shifted the haul to trucks. By 1960, diesel trucks on bulldozed roads had changed how the work was done across the entire Northwest. What the truck gave the trade: haul routes for a fraction of the cost, reach into timber no spur could pay for, and an end to men walking the tops of moving cars in the rain. What it did not give anyone: a reason to walk a quarter-mile of wet steel at dawn and know, from the water between the ties and the film on the railhead, exactly how much train the mountain would allow that day. Frank Aldrich did not know this was what 12 years on the grades had built in him. He knew it the morning the steel gang started lifting the spur behind him as he took the last loads down, the railroad disappearing from the mountain at the same pace he descended it. The grade had known what to ask of him. No one had thought to tell the road to ask.